Now, I actually like Google Forms. I think it's an effective way to collect data from pretty much anyone in the world in only a matter of minutes. But even when I only knew HTML and CSS, Google Forms always left me with wanting more. It's part of the reason I learned how to build out the backend stuff. But as you know, in a couple of minutes, you don't really want to spend time building out the backend. So that's why this series exists. I want to show you a better way and a dev tool that's going to make it much more effective so you can go from something like this to something more like this. How we're going to do this is by using Pure HTML Forms and TailwindCSS. Tailwind gives us a bunch of classes and styles out of the gates. It's really effective. All we need is the CDN from Tailwind in conjunction with Flowbite to have some references of different forms we might want to use. And we're also going to be using KwesForms. This is the dev tool that it's all about. This is what's going to handle our backend and ingest all of that data for us. It's very easy to use, as we'll see. And we're going to host everything on GitHub pages so that all you need to do is submit a index.html file, and then you'll end up with something like this. Now, of course, this is a little bit different than what I showed you before, but with some style changes and understanding a little bit about Tailwind CSS, you can easily go from this to this. But I want to show you how to do all of that. Let's take a look right now. Now, in under 10 minutes, we're going to go from 0 to this form right here that has a public URL using GitHub and, of course, KwesForms, where we can actually grab that data from that form. Let's take a look. To get started, you need a GitHub account, so be sure to sign up for one of those right now. We will create a new repository in just a moment. You're also going to want to sign up on KwesForms using this link right here. If you use my link, I get an affiliate commission every month that you are a customer, if you ever become one. And of course, you could also do that too by becoming your own affiliate. Now, the other part that doesn't have anything to do with my affiliate is using the promo code of 20% off for the entire year. This works for monthly or yearly billing. It's completely up to you on how you go about doing this. But of course, there is also a forever free tier, in which case you can absolutely use this up to 100 submissions a month, which I think is great and enough to convince you that KwesForms might be well worth the investment. So let's go ahead and jump back into GitHub and create our new repository here. I'm going to call this my KwesForms landing. You can call it whatever you like, but the main thing is that it needs to be a public repository because this is going to be a public website, a public web page. And so you can add things if you like. You don't really need to. I'm going to go ahead and add a README file that I'll change later, but we'll go ahead and create this repository for now. And I'm going to work through everything right in GitHub itself. So that means I'm going to go ahead and create a new index file inside of my repo here, and I'll just call this index and .html. This is the standard file that HTML files look for, is the index.html. If I jump into the TailwindCSS.com website, then into docs, in the documentation, the installation portion, if I go to play CDN here, I can actually copy their hello world script that uses their content delivery network for the Tailwind CSS. We can customize things in here as well. That's just not something I'm going to do. I'm going to do very basic, straightforward stuff. I'm going to copy that and we'll bring it into index.html just like that. And what I want is I want to just bring in a form here. So I'm going to do some very basic stuff and just say input type being text and the name being name, like the person's name. And then I'll go ahead and say placeholder equals to your name. And then I'll go ahead and do a button. So I'll do input type being submit. And we'll give it a value of just submit. Okay, so some basic HTML here. I'm going to go ahead and commit these changes, create index.html, go ahead and commit them directly to the main branch, all of that. The point is to have some sort of index file in here that we'll be able to modify here very soon. Next up, what I want to do is jump into the settings of this repo, and I want to look for pages here. If I go into pages, I can see that I can actually start the process of building out a page. So in our case, we're going to deploy from a branch just to make it really simple and easy. You can absolutely use GitHub Actions if you understand that process. Next, we select which branch we want to use, which in our case, it's going to just be the main branch, and it's going to be the root of the repo itself. I'll explain both of these things in just a moment, but I'll go ahead and save this. this will turn our repository here into a GitHub URL. And notice that you can absolutely have a custom domain in here and all that. That's not something I'm going to do at this point, but I do have this coding4entrepreneurs.github.io domain that you will also have at this point. So if I actually open that up, I will get this 404 page. But if I were to add in my repo URL, that right there, to the very end of it, and look at that page, I should eventually see something different here, which we'll see very soon once the page is fully ready to go and fully able to be accessed itself. So another key part of this is that root and that branch. So if we go into the code here, we can see that the main is here. Of course, I'm talking to those of you who don't really know how to do GitHub yet, but we've got our main branch here. It's the only branch you should have if you did everything I just did. And then index.html is in the root of it, as in it's not in a folder in here. It's in the root of this repo. It's in the basic of it. Notice that it says pending on here. This has everything to do with getting our GitHub actions done, as well as how the GitHub pages end up working. And so once that ends up being green, then you'll see that it's actually fully ready for us, and we could be able to refresh on our site here, and there is my hello world page, right? So you have a little bit of a downtime for the workflow to end up running, and this all happens automatically for you. You never have to think about it. You really just have to think about the code that you're changing here. So let's actually change this form to work with KwesForms. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to jump into my account. I skipped a few steps, but now I'm going to go ahead and add in a website. This website is going to be our GitHub page, right? So you can use the entire URL here for the website itself. And I'm going to go ahead and just say my GitHub repo as the name. And then the allowed domains, we're going to go ahead and do this right here. Okay, so go ahead and add that website in. And then we want to create our very first form. And we'll go ahead and say our MVP landing form, as in an MVP page. We don't need a redirect URL. You can absolutely use reCAPTCHA, but you don't have to do that yet. And then we've got these spam filters here that help filter out the data that comes through. So I'm going to go ahead and add this form in now. Now, what do you know? It just gives me this action right here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this action, and I'm going to go back into my index.html. I'm going to go ahead and edit this file. In this form itself, I'm going to go ahead and add that action in. I also want to add in a method of being post. Typically, when you're creating data, you use the post method, which of course it actually has it on the example itself. Now I'm going to go ahead and commit these changes, save them, have it run. And so what's going to happen here is, if I go back to the root of my project, this will be orange because it's pending. That means the build hasn't finished, which won't take very long. You can also go into the GitHub Actions file tab here, and you'll also see what's happening with that progress in terms of the website being finished. It's just basically to refresh this web page. Those of you who are familiar with static web pages, this might seem like an extra step that maybe shouldn't happen, but overall, in terms of GitHub and making sure that our static web pages works, I actually really appreciate that they are using those GitHub actions. And so I just want that to finish. Once this turns green, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the form. Okay, so I've got my green check here. I'm going to go ahead and refresh on my URL page here. I want to inspect the element here. I just want to make sure that my form actually has the endpoint for my KwesForms. So I'll go ahead and say my name is Justin, hit submit, and submit that data. There is my thank you page. What do you know? It was submitted successfully. Now, a part of this is because I don't have a redirect of any kind or the other configurations that might come through. But of course, I can always go back to that form itself. Now I can go ahead and say next. If I wanted to supercharge my form, which I do recommend, you add in this script here, which is very straightforward. Once again, we go into index.html, we edit this file, and we can add this right before that body tag there. And I'll go ahead and commit those changes and save them. Next up, we're going to go back into the KwesForms and we'll go to the next one. We can add fields. We already added fields in here, and I can do it again. And then of course I can add this class in here just to make sure that our script is working correctly. So once again, I'll go back into my file here and I'll go ahead and add in that class. And we'll do, instead of update, I'll just say custom class for KwesForm form. And I'll go ahead and commit that with a little bit better of a message of the change. And of course, that's going to trigger off another action workflow. But I'll go ahead and hit next. Now I can also add in these rules. We'll talk about these more in just a little bit, but feel free to experiment with them on your own. And you can go into the docs as well. And then of course, it's waiting for the first submission, which in my case, it actually did submit already. So I could probably go back to the GitHub repo webpage and then look at that form. And there are my submissions. So if I go back into my page here and do another one, exclamation mark, hit submit, give it a second, it'll load, it's going to run, and then we can go back into KwesForms, refresh in here, there's that data. Cool. So we're already collecting data in a matter of less than 10 minutes. Of course, now all we need to do is improve what this looks like and maybe add in additional features that KwesForms has. But this alone, to me, opened up the gates. This is why I was convinced this is a project worth looking at and spending time on, because of how quickly I was able to just spin up a form in general like this one, or of course, taking it just a little bit further, especially if you already know Tailwind. This is not that far of a stretch from this one right here. It's pretty cool. Now we're going to go ahead and just change the input design slightly, just so you can see the iterative process you would take to make this look a lot better. So in Flowbite.com, if you do a search for forms, you'll see the Tailwind CSS forms for Flowbite. Now the point of this is not to master everything related to Flowbite, but rather just find some examples that they have. So this one right here, the very first one, is a great example of an input that we can use, as well as a form class itself. So it's really just this right here, as well as this. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we're going to bring it on over to our repo into index.html. I'm going to go ahead and edit this file, and inside of my form here, I'm going to go ahead and place that email right above. Okay, and so we've got our label for the email, and then I've got my input for the email. So at this point, my input doesn't have a name. So in order for our KwesForms to work, we need to add in a name here. And so I'll go ahead and add name of email. I'm actually going to copy this one more time. And this name is going to just be name once again, just like we had before. The type now is going to be text. And then we'll just go ahead and say label for name. And we'll go ahead and say your name. And then we'll go ahead and change the ID to name. And then we'll go ahead and say, Jon Snow or whatever your name is. And you can put a placeholder there if you'd like. And I'll get rid of this old one and we'll leave it like that. So what this will do is make at least our form itself look quite a bit better. We'll commit these changes and I'll let them run. The way it's going to look quite a bit better is it's really just going to be formatted like this. Of course, I can also update the button too. I don't have a button class right now. I can quite literally use this entire button and then come back into my HTML here, go ahead and edit this file, and then once again, go into replace my old button with this new one. Now, one thing I'll note about Tailwind that maybe you're not familiar with is all of these classes right here, they are very verbose. Like we have to write a bunch of different classes in order for this thing to work correctly. That is one of the positives of Tailwind, even if you come from a different CSS world where this is looked down upon. Tailwind makes it very explicit as to what's going on. Text white, I'm sure you could guess what that means. BG typically stands for background blue. That might also be something that's fairly obvious as to what's going on, as well as hover, and focus, Maybe you know what these things are, maybe you don't, but the experimenting with Tailwind and how well it ends up making the elements look is great. So yes, there's some downsides to using Tailwind is that it ends up being a really long HTML page or HTML class, but the positives outweigh that downside. Because the other thing is, people that know Tailwind will be able to really easily start to modify your page really quickly based off of the different classes you have. And again, this has nothing to do with KwesForms itself. KwesForms' job is mostly done. There is still something else we could do. So I do want to improve the site a little bit more. But overall, KwesForms is there. It's just running, it's working, and it's ready to go. So once again, I'll do this one and we'll say update submit button or something like that for commit messages. Just in general, if this is your first time doing stuff like this, make these messages fairly accurate to what you did and only make small changes at a time, so it's easier to go back in time. That's really what Git's all about. So at this point, I should probably have a new action running, whereas the more recent one actually did finish. So if I refresh in this page, I now see a little bit better of a form. Now, granted, it's not that much better because it really just takes up the entire page, but it is now responsive and looks quite a bit different, right? So now if I do this test and submit this, notice I just added a brand new field, right? Now, inside of Quest, if I go in my form itself, refresh in here, I can actually see that data. I collect that data, and there is my email and my domain and some other metadata information. But I just added a brand new field. Now, if you come from the SQL world, I did not have to run any migrations whatsoever. It just added it. Now, of course, this isn't a whole lot different than what Google Sheets does because, well, that's a lot like what it does, which is nice. But the thing is, I can change my forms as I see fit on the fly at any time. I can add a field, I can remove a field, and KwesForms will pick that up based off of the fact that we add a name to it, right? So in our code, if we look back at our code, we can see that each input has a unique name in here, name and name, right? It's pretty great in that sense. It's really just that simple, which is why I think it's so great. So if I refresh in my GitHub page now, I see the button has changed. All of those changes have propagated. So I can just keep iterating on this until I have something that resembles this right here. Editing our project on GitHub is not really ideal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone the code, bring it to my local machine, make changes there, and then I'll push that to GitHub. So if you don't know Git just yet, then you can stick with editing in GitHub yourself. I'm going to go ahead and also use VS Code or Visual Studio Code to make this happen. So in order for this to work, I'm going to go ahead and open up my terminal window into a location where I like to create and store my projects. And I'll run git clone and then that URL. And then I'll go ahead and navigate into that project and then, or rather into the directory that it created for me. And then I'll open it up in VS Code. And so this is where I'll work from here on out. And then I'll be able to actually open this up into my local browser, right? So by default, it usually opens up inside of the actual editor itself. But if I were to open it up in my browser, I can actually see the exact same form that we've been working off of. So now that I have this local, this is where I'll do a bunch of tests, because really the GitHub one is mostly for when we're done with all of the changes we want to make and we now want it to be live, whereas this is going to be more of a development mode. Hopefully you already know that, but if you don't, you do now. This styling right here, although it is better than what it started out as, we want to improve it even more so it actually does look better than that Google form itself. The way we're going to do that is by using Flowbite and all of the references that are available for various Tailwind components. So to do this, we're going to go ahead and jump into the docs on flowbite.com, into the introduction section, and look for the CDN version. And then you're going to go ahead and grab this CSS right here. And we're going to go ahead and bring it on over into index.html. And I'll paste it right after TailwindCSS. One of the things I probably don't need is this JavaScript here, but I'll go ahead and bring that one in as well. And after our KwesForm script in there too. Once again, you probably don't need the Flowbite one, but I'll bring it in just because that's what it's recommending you do. Now what I'm going to do is jump into blocks here, and I'm going to look for a specific block that has a form right in the middle of the page. That block is going to be either login or register. Both of these things are good examples of what you could do. I'm going to go ahead and stick with login because I think it's a little bit more simple. And so I'm going to grab this login page here, and I see this show code. Now there are other examples that might be worth your while of investing into, but for now we're just going to go ahead and stick with the basic example of the login page and screen. So notice that it starts with just a section itself, and there's also Tailwind specific configuration in here, mostly this primary color, which I'll change in just a moment, but the idea being that the HTML is not an entire HTML page. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this code. I'll go into index.html, and basically above our form and h1 tag, I'll go ahead and paste that code in there. What I also want to do is change everything that's dash primary dash, and I want to just do a Command F, and we're going to change that to dash primary, or instead of primary, dash blue dash. The primary one is a modified Tailwind class. Blue is an actual Tailwind class. So I'll go ahead and use that, and we'll go ahead and take a look at index.html now. If I refresh in here, I now see that login page. If I scroll down a bit, I still see my form. Naturally, I want to move my form up to this login page and change things about this login page that we don't want, like we don't actually want to have somebody log in. That's not what we're doing here. So the first thing is I'll go ahead and change this sign into your account to being our initial thing of hello world, and I'll go ahead and say hello world once again, right? Next up is the actual form elements themselves. A lot of them I could probably just use what I've been using because they are all based in Tailwind. So come down and grab those elements in here, the first two inputs that is, and I might want to rechange the order, but then back into this form class, I got this div, and probably even this one. And it looks like I just have the button in there. So if I paste in my form elements, I can go ahead and reorganize them or reorder them, and then we'll paste them in like this. Now, of course, if you know HTML and CSS already, this part is probably very easy to, or very straightforward at least. Next up, of course, we're going to go ahead and add in our KwesForm action and class. And so we'll bring this up here into this class, and we'll paste this in, and I'll just go ahead and add that class in. I also want to make sure that I'm bringing in the method. I just hit enter to separate this out a little bit, and it's going to be our post method in there. And there we go. So that is a div class, which is peculiar. That should be a form class, not a div class. So it looks like maybe I put it in the wrong spot. And sure enough, I did. So let's go ahead and grab this and bring it into the correct spot. And we'll do that over here as well. Okay, and there we go. So now our form should look at least a little bit better. Let's get rid of some of these extra things. As you can see, this is a good reason to use a text editor like VSCode. And then I'll go ahead and get rid of my original one and paste it like that. There we go. Let's go back and look at our index here. And there's our new hello world. It's very, very similar to what we saw before. I'll go ahead and change this from sign in to join waitlist or whatever. And then I'll go ahead and get rid of this button or the extra stuff in there. Save that, and instead of this being called Flowbite, we're going to go ahead and call this our landing page. And of course, you can put your own logo in there. I'll just get rid of their logo, and we'll refresh in there. And there we go. So now I've got this join waitlist, and I'll just go ahead and say hello world and ABC at my new form.com. Join waitlist. Everything seems to work great in terms of KwesForms, and it even empties out the page itself. Next up, going back into KwesForms, let's just take a look that our inbox actually has some new stuff in here, and it looks like it's not actually coming through just yet. Let's go into our spam. There it is. It is a spam element in here, as well as a few other things that are spam elements as well. So with this in mind, let's go ahead and do git status, git add, git commit, and updated with Flowbite. And then we'll do git push. And that's going to, of course, push it into my GitHub repo here, which should trigger a pending new page to be coming out. Great. So this is just implementing Flowbite. As you might imagine, we could talk about Tailwind and Flowbite for many different courses to learn all of the elements that went through. A big part of the reason I continue to use Tailwind and Flowbite is there are so many projects and applications out there that you can just grab the code and start using it right away. And then with KwesForms, of course, we can just add in our inputs and elements in there as we see fit. Very, very straightforward. I want to actually create one more page just so we can see one of the other aspects that KwesForms has, and that is page redirects. All right, so I actually have my production landing page up and running now. It looks significantly better, and we could obviously do all sorts of things in here thanks to Tailwind as well as Flowbite. I'm going to leave those things to you at this point, but what I want to do is have a redirect to a success page. After this is filled out, I want it to just go somewhere else. That somewhere else is going to resemble this landing page quite a bit, but overall, I just want to see what the success page might look like. So let's go into KwesForms and then go into the Learn section for the documentation. Of course, there's all kinds of documentation here that's really easy to get going, but the one I'm looking for is after submission and specifically redirect. There's two different ways on how you can go about defining this. The data-kw, I like this one because it's actually more verbose as to what's happening here and what's doing it. Although the pretty one is nice as well. But I like the ones that are verbose so I can see what tool is using it. It's really nice that both are supported. So if I go back into index.html into my form class here, I can go ahead and add that redirect on, and we can actually bring it into where we want it to be redirected. So what I need is the root URL. In this case, the root URL is KwesForms landing, right? So the actual repo name as well as my GitHub account name, right? If you had a custom domain, which you easily can do with GitHub pages, you could use that. And so what we want here is what do we want to redirect this to? In our case, we'll go ahead and do thankyou.html. So that means that I need to create this thankyou.html page, of course, but that's how simple the redirect is. I'll go ahead and duplicate index.html and change it to thankyou.html. And I'll quite literally get rid of the form that's in here. Of course, you could always add a new form if you wanted to, but I'm going to go ahead and just say thank you, and we'll be in touch. So simple as that. Locally, I can just go ahead and take a look at it as thankyou.html. There you go. Maybe that's what you want, maybe not. I'm going to go ahead and do something like text center, just a simple way to bring all of that text in the middle. And there we go. Thank you, will be in touch. I probably don't need that landing page anymore. I'll go ahead and get rid of that. And there is our new thank you page, as well as our redirect on index.html. So I'm going to go ahead and push this. I'll do git status, git add, git commit, added thank you page, and then we'll go ahead and push it. Great. And so this will take a moment for it to come out completely, to be completely done and working in production. But overall, it's really just that simple. And we could have constant redirects. So after that thank you, I could have a redirect to another page. So if you want to chain together a bunch of different forms that you're just asking a bunch of different questions, you totally could. As far as I know, KwesForms is working on a way to have all of those forms easily integrated. It's just not available just yet. That's only a small use case, I would imagine. But overall, this landing page here is something that you'll be able to test things out. Granted, it doesn't look exactly like this, but it's going in that direction overall. All you need to do is learn a little bit more about Tailwind to get this exactly. Because this is also responsive. So if I break it down, you can see how responsive it is, and it works really, really well. So checking into GitHub, it looks like the new version has been released. So I'll go ahead and try this out again. And we'll do roast beef and abc at gmail.com. Go ahead and join that wait list. And so there we go. Thank you. We'll be in touch. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. Just a real simple redirect inside of our form. Now, one of the things when it comes to using forms in general is having validation. The reason we want validation is so that when the user is putting in some information, we get errors when things are done incorrectly and they happen on the form itself, not somewhere else, right? So in this case, we're going to go ahead and change this a little bit so it renders out. It's very similar to this. And the way we do that is in the form validation and the validation rules. The first one I want to take a look at is the minimum. I want a minimum number of characters for any given field. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and use either one of these. I'll stick with the HTML pretty rules, and I'm going to go ahead and bring it into my input here for my name, and then I'll go ahead and paste this in. I'm actually going to get rid of the HTML required here just to see what we could do in terms of validation. But I've got these rules here, so let's go ahead and take a look at our form. I'll refresh in here, and if I just type out A, it gives me this validation. Now, you may or may not want this message here. Perhaps you don't. If you don't want that message there, what you can do is this after submission, you can disable messages. So you can do no success message or more specifically, no error message. You can also change them as well. But let's go ahead and just add in the no error message on here as well so we don't see the error message for the form itself. This should actually be on the form, not on the input. So back on the form up here, there we go. So that's one way you could write it, or you could write it with the data KW. Let's go ahead and try that one. And there we go. Either one will work great. So back into our form itself, the validation now will just be on the field itself, which is what I prefer when it comes to errors like this. So now the next one is, of course, if I type that, that is going to work. And if I don't type anything, it's saying it's green. It's saying it's successful. So all of the validation errors actually do work. But what I want to do is I want to change it so that the field itself is required. So there's a way to chain together rules themselves. We use a pipe. And the rule itself is going to just be simply required, which of course we can put on the HTML element as well. But if you actually put it in as rules, you can see in here that when I select it and then don't select it or whatever, it does the same sort of validation that you would if for some reason you accidentally didn't put required on that input. Now, the nice thing about this is as you get more advanced, you could have this as some sort of definition somewhere else. So if you're using Django or Flask, you could then have these standardized definitions where then your HTML itself is just one of those other template values that you would end up using and stuff like that. That's outside the context of this one, but using these validations is very straightforward, and there's a lot of different options in here as you see, so feel free to check them out. Like, for example, if you wanted a actual text input to be an email or an email format, that's how you'd go about doing it. Or if you wanted to make sure that your email was a certain length and stuff like that, you would go that way as well. Now, you can also make your own custom validation rules, but that, of course, requires you to write out some JavaScript itself. As you can see in here, there are some additional elements that you can add in as far as the rules are concerned. That's outside the scope of what we want to do. The next part I want to do is some conditional logic that we might want that would better correspond to using something very similar to like Google Forms. So let's take a look. Now we're going to go ahead and add in some conditional logic into our form so that if they enter a Gmail account, we prompt them for just another email, maybe their work email account. So to do this, we're going to use the conditional logic that, of course, KwesForm comes with, and realistically, this right here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this, and what we want to do is actually copy our email field here. I'm going to copy this whole thing. We'll paste it in here, and this one is going to be called for work email, and we'll just replace some parts of email with simply work email, and then we'll go and say your work email. So without any logic, of course, it'll just render out and it'll show both of these things. We don't want that. We actually want the work email to come up only if it says Gmail. So to do this, we're going to go in this div tag here and we'll do KW show. And what we want is the conditional logic based off of the fields themselves. So in our case, it's going to be fields dot. Well, what are the fields that are available? At this time, there's 3 fields available. One has the name of work email, one has the name of email, and then of course one has the name of simply name. So what we could do is we could say fields.name equals to Justin, something along those lines, but of course using single quotes in here. And that would then render that out. So if I save this and then refresh on my index page, notice that field is gone, and as soon as I type out Justin, it comes in. So this is how you can do absolutely equals. Now the conditions themselves, we can actually use JavaScript related fields. So I can do .ends with, and it's a capital W there. And then in here I can do gmail.com, right? So I can save that. Now if I refresh in here and do Justin and then abc@gmail.com, that will, in theory, go ahead and show up my field itself. Oh, this should not be name, but rather email ends with that. So let's try it again. Justin, abc@gmail.com. And there we go. So I used the correct field, and then I can join this waitlist. But notice that this is still not required. So it's definitely something we'll still have to figure out. But overall, we can use this condition on any of the fields themselves. So let's go ahead and pipe this one more time. And I'll do 2 pipes here and do another one and do something like yahoo.com. Do people still have those emails? I don't know. But what I want to see here is, does JavaScript logic actually work in these 2 fields? So that is a JavaScript condition right there. I'm going to go ahead and try this out. I'll refresh in here. And now I'll go ahead and do abc@yahoo.com. And what do you know? That one works, and so does Gmail. It's pretty fantastic. Now let's take a look at how we can require this one if this email has changed. Now we need to add in some validation for our work email. That is the abc@gmail.com thing where this says work email. So the way we're going to do this is by testing out something that actually fails already. So if I change this to something like Gmailer and hit join waitlist, I get an error, or I don't get anything actually. It just doesn't send. And this is because if you look at the work email itself, it is a required element. It's just hidden, so the user can't see it. So if I remove that from being a required element, well, now I need that extra validation, because if I do put in Gmail here, I need to make sure that this field is showing up and it is required. And then if it's not showing up, then we have it not required, basically. And so there are some different rules that you might be able to try to use, but the thing is, once we add in conditional logic like this, we really need to use a custom validator. So let's take a look at this inside of KwesForms documentation for this custom validation rules. And we're going to scroll down with our CDN and just grab this JavaScript right here. And we're going to go ahead and bring that over into our index.html. And we'll put it after our other JavaScript. Cool. So I'm going to change these into constants. I like using constants. And in this case, we're not going to say no Gmail accounts allowed. We'll say work email is required, not Gmail or Yahoo. Something like that. That being our error message. So there's a couple different features as to how we want this to work. First off, we get my form, as in the form ID. Notice that I have it at document get elements by ID. Now, if you know JavaScript, you know this well. You understand what's going on here. If you don't know JavaScript, the get element by ID is really looking for a HTML element that has an ID of whatever that ID is. In our case, that ID is simply my form. This is quite literally what it's looking for on the entire page. And so whatever we end up naming that form ID, we want to put in this custom rule as well. So in my case, I'll go ahead and say my form ID is equal to whatever this is. And then we'll go ahead and put this in both of these places. Next up, we're going to go ahead and say const my input name. And what is the name of the element you're going to be using? In our case, we want to validate the work email input, and that's what we're going to put here. So if I scroll back up a little bit, the work input is this right here. So work email, whatever that value is, we're going to put this down here. Now again, if you don't know JavaScript well, this could be pretty tricky, so maybe it's outside the scope of what you should be doing. But if you do know JavaScript, you can see where we're going with this. So the next thing is what we want to check is not just the value of this particular form element, which this actually does work. So you can say basically if it's that, or we'll go ahead and do Yahoo. Just take a look and make sure that that's happening. So let's go into our form here. And I'll go ahead and say roast beef and then abc@gmail. And then if I come in here and do Gmail again, we'll say work email is required, not work is required. And so there we go. But if I leave it empty, it's saying green. So that's not what we want. We want it to not be empty. So this one works pretty well. The next function that we want is we're going to create another function. And this function itself is going to be get our current email value. So the non-work email value, basically. This is just going to be a function that's going to go based off of the form itself. So we'll do const email input, and this is going to be form.querySelector, and this is going to be input, the name being email. Okay, so again, if you don't know JavaScript, this is complicated, but the idea being whatever we put this name here is going to be the input it's looking for, which in our case is going to be this one right here. And in this case, we also want to see that this input, what that value is. So to do that, we're going to return a string that we'll do some substitution with at the $sign of email input dot value. And the value is the argument on that input itself. So what we want then is down in this function, when it's doing the validation, we're going to go ahead and say const current email value is equal to get current email value. And now we'll do some logic in here as well. But I also want to check to make sure that this value is not empty. So I'll go ahead and say const value empty, and that's going to be equal to value is equal to null, or the value is equal to a empty string. There's probably more things I could do with that, but basically we'll go ahead and say if value empty, then we're going to go ahead and return the true value. This callback function is looking for if it's true or not. That's really it. So if it's empty, then we want to say, hey, it's required, which will raise this email part right here. And this will happen if this is not empty. So basically we want to say if it's empty and something about this current value. So what we want to do is this same kind of equation here, and we'll go ahead and do function check is valid domain, something along those lines. And we'll go ahead and say value in here. And what we want to return is basically this same concept right here. And of course, we could always make that better. And so the first one, we'll just go ahead and leave it in here as check valid domain of that value. And then we can also do the check valid domain of the current email value, right? And so basically the current email value is going to be one of those things. So if it finds that, that's going to be true. And the value is empty, it's also going to be true. So basically check valid domain, or check, that should probably be check non-work domain. Let's change it to that so it's a little bit better described. But there we go. So now it's going to see if it's empty and it's a work domain of that current value from the other field, and this is empty, that it's doing that. Otherwise, it's going to check the non-work domain for this one, and then it'll do that as well. So let's go ahead and verify that inside of our field now. And once again, we'll do something in here like roast beef and abc@gmail.com. And then we'll go ahead and put abc@gmail. Work email is required. If I change it to Gmailer, then it looks like it's going to be okay. If I change it to Yahoo, then it's going to go ahead and give me an error. If I leave it empty, it's also going to give me an error. Great. And the only reason we need this is because we added this customization that you may or may not do, right? So this show method in here, this part you might do, you might not. The other part about this is you can actually add in a similar kind of event listener on the other field and then actually display a field itself. So you could actually change the show in here based off of that other event listener that we just created, this custom validator that's going to be going through based off of these custom rules. So that's pretty cool. Now, again, this is a little bit more advanced. If you don't know JavaScript, maybe you got lost in this. But if you do know JavaScript, you'll see that this is fairly straightforward and pretty easy to set up and do. Now we're going to go ahead and automate the process of getting our KwesForm data, which of course is available on our KwesForm account. You could always export it if you wanted to, but I want to actually automate it into Google Drive into an actual spreadsheet. The way this is going to be done or managed at this time is through Zapier. It's a native connection that KwesForms has as one of the integrations that are available. So make sure that you sign up for Zapier at Zapier.com. Just grab a free account. The free account should work just fine until you start getting a lot of entries coming through. Next up in Google Drive, you're going to want to create a new spreadsheet in here. So this spreadsheet, we want to designate, well, the name. So I'm going to call this my MVP landing entries. And then I want to give the actual sheet itself the fields that I want. So like name, email, work email, and maybe date. Right? So those are the fields that I want to grab from my form. The sheet itself is going to be our, landing page main or something along those lines. It could be our index page. You could call it whatever you like. But the main thing is we have the field names that we're going to use. You actually can change these names. They don't have to actually match what you have in KwesForms. Next up in KwesForms, we'll go into the integrations tab of any given form. Go ahead and hit add integration. And we're going to go ahead and use the Zapier one. So KwesForms can help you actually create the zaps right here. And so the one we're going to do is a very common one, which of course is adding it into Google Sheets. You could always do a Slack message, and you can do several other things as well. And let's go ahead and create our first zap here. So what I want to do is just do the absolute basics right in here. But the point of this is to make sure that you actually have a Zapier account. You might have to log into it on KwesForms at this point. But what I want to do is I'm going to retitle this as to MVP landing. I'm going to go ahead and start the integration process. So the first thing is connecting KwesForms. So it says to sign in. And to sign in, we get our API key. Now in my case, I'm going to just go ahead and open up another KwesForms URL into the dashboard, into my API key settings here. And if you need to refresh the token, just go ahead and do that. And then you're going to bring it into your Zapier integration, just like that. I just had to navigate through the tabs there. Once I do that, it's going to look like this. And obviously you can change that at any time, but that's going to connect the KwesForm itself. Then we look for the trigger. The trigger is going to be the form that has some submissions. In our case, MVP landing form is the only form we have available. Then I'm going to go ahead and refresh the fields just to make sure I have all the fields that I want. And there we go. So we can test out this trigger. And what this is going to do is give us some of our recent submissions, or maybe our most recent submission, which is what we've got here. You might have other ones in here as well. So if you go to find new records, you can just kind of get a sense as to what's going on with these various records. But the main one being that our work email needs to come through. We need to see work email in here, as well as name and all of the other data we might want. In our case, it's going to be date submitted. So once we have that, we're going to go ahead and continue. And I'm going to use that record as what we'll use in Google Sheets. So in this case, I want to go ahead and make sure that I'm connected into Google Sheets as well. So like whatever you end up doing, we're going to go ahead and create a spreadsheet row. There's many other things that you could do with this. Zapier is very easy and also very complex as to what you could do. I think it's both things. Then we're going to go ahead and connect to Google Sheets. In this case, I'm just using a whatever account. You can connect basically any account to this. You go ahead and allow it to access that account, and then you can go ahead and hit continue. Next up, you select the drive that you want to use, which of course is going to be your Google Drive. Then you're going to go ahead and grab the spreadsheet you want to use, MVP landing entries. What do you know? If we go into MVP landing entries, that's the name of the form that we want to use. Then we can go into our worksheet itself. Whatever worksheet name you gave it, I gave it the name of landing page main. And there are our different fields that are in here. So that's these columns right here. You absolutely want to have those already in there. And then we can just select the data we want to use. So name being roast beef. The next field being our email. The next field being our work email. So let's go ahead and just search it. Work email, there we go. And then the next field, the date being something related to the date, which we could do date submitted or updated. I'm going to go ahead and just do date submitted. And then we'll go ahead and hit continue. And then finally, we will go ahead and test this step. This is going to test everything for you. Now, if you don't do it in the order I did, there's a possibility that these things don't work correctly. So just make sure you try to do it in the order I did in terms of the data you put in. You want to make sure you have your columns in there. And of course, once I had my columns in there, I was able to actually associate the form data. We basically tie in that one example into the fields that are going to go in here. And I also left out a lot of data from this because maybe I want all of the data, maybe I only want some of it. It's really nice that we can pick and choose those things. So this is one of the most recent entries. So now going forward, all of these entries will be able to come through and we'll be able to use them. Now, using and managing Zapier inside of KwesForms is fine. You could totally do it that way. But I actually prefer doing it inside of Zapier itself and then going into the Zaps here. And you can see it's the exact same process, but you get the whole page here and then you can change things as you see fit, or you can just review them. Make sure that it's on. If it's not on and it's not published, it's not going to actually work. It's not going to handle the newly submitted data. So now let's go ahead and actually submit some new data. Now, I actually don't have to test this locally because as long as KwesForms receives data and is connected into Zapier, this new submission trigger will go, and then a new entry should go in as well, assuming that all of that form data is still there. Because of course, if you change field names, whether it's on KwesForms or in the MVP landing, spreadsheet itself, if you change these field names, things will naturally break because you changed a bunch of stuff and maybe you didn't change them everywhere. So now I'm going to go ahead and just say hello world Zapier, and I'll go ahead and do abc@yahoo.com, which will prompt me for my email. If I go to join, it doesn't work yet. So I'll go ahead and do test@dundermifflin.com. I think that's how you spell it. Let's go ahead and run that. Thank you. We'll be in touch. Great. So this isn't going to appear instantly because there's a couple of different steps it has to go through. First, it has to go into KwesForms, right? So we can definitely check our KwesForm data and see if it's in here. So if it's in here, then it's going to take a moment. There it is. Hello, world Zapier. And we've got all of that data that we wanted. It's going to take a moment for that to finish. Then it's going to run through Zapier. Then it's going to go ahead and update inside of the spreadsheet itself. So not necessarily as fast as using a native Google form like you could do, but it is far more effective in my opinion because you can do so much more stuff with it. And in your Zapier, you can actually add another step after this and several other steps where maybe it goes to another spreadsheet on another area. And maybe it's just the name or maybe it's just the email. Or it can also update your Slack or it could do all sorts of other things in here that Zapier does really well. And all of it, of course, is no code, which makes it really, really non-technical friendly. But now we've got our Zaps going and it's working right inside of that particular form. It's far more effective to do it this way than to try and manually do this and build out your own code. But it's also way faster and probably easier to manage overall. I know I flew through Zapier stuff. This changes over time, so the way it actually works is roughly the same. You'll have a trigger, you'll have something to do with that trigger, and then you can do several other things. So that process does change a little bit. But the trigger itself, the key part was getting that initial data and making sure that that initial data actually existed, which is why we want to submit our form with all of the fields as much as possible as our most recent entry that's in there so we can grab the fields that we want to grab. But of course, now that pretty much completes what we set out to do, which was to make a better looking form that is better looking than Google Forms. This, of course, is very basic, and there's a lot of things that we can do to this to make it even better looking. But just because it's basic doesn't mean that it's not better than what we had before in terms of the way we could design it and the way we can control it. Those things I think are really, really effective. And now that we have the integration into, the Google Forms, it just makes it that much easier thanks to KwesForms and Zapier, of course. For the last part of this, we're going to use the KwesForms API to get the data with Python. Because maybe you want to use it with Zapier, or maybe you want to go a little bit more advanced and use something like Python. And to do this, we're going to be using Python requests and a way to load in environment variables using Python decouple. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the code in terms of writing it, mostly because some of you know how to do this, some of you don't. But the idea being it's actually this simple to grab all of your submissions for your data. I would imagine over time that the actual API will change slightly, but the way it's going to change is going to be well written right in here. So if you get all submissions, there it is. Maybe at some point we'll see paginated responses. As of now, I believe it gets all of the submissions that come through. So it might take a little bit of time before you actually get all of those things. So the idea here is we can get our submissions from this endpoint, the form ID, which we'll set in a moment. Then we set up our authorization and then our content types. Then we grab that data and then we just print out that data. Now the cool thing about this is then we could actually put it into something like Python Pandas or something a little bit more advanced to do different analysis from it. Or we could actually use SQL and actually put this into a SQL database somewhere as well and just have this run on a regular basis where KwesForms is still doing all of the heavy lifting, but then this part could be done on a number of different forms and a number of different form IDs and just done on a cron job or some sort of regular process. So I actually want to run this now, and the way I'm doing it is with a Python virtual environment. I also have this .env file, which is what all of this is going to do. And then this git ignore is just to make sure that those things don't go into the Git repo itself. This is very straightforward Python code. So check out my series 30 Days of Python if you don't know Python and you want to know how to do all of this. But the idea being inside of my .env, I need to get my KwesForms ID or the actual form ID I've been using. So in my account, I'll go ahead and navigate into the dashboard, into my form itself, grab the form, open up that form itself, and then the ID is going to be in the URL up here. It's this one right here. Now, of course, you can use the API to get all the different forms and websites and all that as well, but I can just grab it from the URL on the dashboard itself. Next up is the API key. So the API key, there is only one API key that we can use. So if we come in here and if we accidentally refresh this token, that will actually break everything we just did with Zapier. So if you did just do a bunch of stuff with Zapier, all you need to do to fix that is to log in, click on apps down here, go to KwesForms, click on the little 3 dots here and hit reconnect. And what it's going to do is it's going to allow you to then reconnect this by putting in that new API key in there. Now it's back to working, or at least in theory, it's back to working. You would probably want to test it further. But with this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and add in my API key in here, and I'm going to go ahead and run this data. I'm just going to run Python and then request form data.py. I'm in a virtual environment, for those of you who know what that is, but I'm calling Python on that Python function or that Python module. I run that, it gets all of the data inside of that form as a list, and it's all JSON data that's coming back that you can then review and analyze as you see fit. Of course, there's so much that you could do with this now that it's programmatic in terms of the actual form itself. You can also go ahead and create forms in here too. So if you are using something like Django or Fast API and you want to be able to create forms on the fly, you could do that doing something very similar to this. And overall, here's what you need to do. You still have the same sort of headers. You just go ahead and do the form, and then you give it a name and stuff like that. And then what comes back is the form ID. That's kind of the key part that you need to have come back, as well as the action itself. Both of those things could then be used to automate the process of building your forms on your own application as you see fit. And I'm sure at some point we'll see even more examples in here. Here's Python request. You can see what that looks like as well. Similar idea in terms of how you actually set this up, and very similar to what we did in our code. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got something out of this one. Now I know that I did. I actually put this entire series already into use. That's why you're seeing it. So what you see here is a landing page that I actually used. Maybe you even visited it because it's going to help convince me whether or not I should undertake this project. I'm pretty sure I'm going to. And that's thanks to the leveraging of GitHub pages, of course, to host my webpage, but also KwesForms. I used that on those forms so I didn't have to worry about the backend. Like I said before, I love building out backends, but sometimes you need to move quickly and just get things working. That's why I partnered up with KwesForms on this one. The other part is it's designed by coding entrepreneurs. They're behind the scenes, bootstrapping KwesForms, making it happen, and I'm a big supporter of that. I hope you are as well. Now, of course, if you want to support them more, not only being a customer, you can also become your own affiliate and sell it as you like. It's really up to you. Overall, I think stuff like KwesForms, little packages that help us do a lot of big things, is something I'm a huge fan of and something I want to tend to work with a lot more. If you see another product or service just like this, please let me know. I want to check it out. I want to see if I can put something together that actually provides value for you and the rest of us. Thanks so much for watching. Look forward to seeing you next time.